All right, well, today's topic is a little bit controversial, and that one is, should we be squatting? So I'm somebody that has loved squatting, particularly back squatting, for most of my life. I've been doing it since the early 90s. But really the question that's been stewing around in my head for the last, close to 2 decades is actually, is the juice worth the squeeze? And now, after thinking about it so long, working with athletes, treating athletes, I really think that the juice is not worth the squeeze. And I think that we want to reconsider what we're classifying as the king exercise of the lower body in the weight room, to what I'm going to propose is the step back lunge that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So before I get into why is the lunge better than the squat, let me first give you my background with squatting. I am someone that has loved squatting for most of my life. There was never a time that I was going to go train and I knew I had to squat, even times when I knew it was likely I might actually vomit that day. But there was never a time that I did not want to be there. I love squatting. When I was training for track and fields, which I did for about 15 years, every day that I got to squat was a great day. So I loved it. And it actually got me to a decently high level in track and field. But, the question is, did it need to actually be there? So my reluctance on the, utility of the squat and strength training is not because I didn't like squatting or I've never really done it before. It's actually, I've been stewing over this for the long time. And now over the last, 5, 6, 7 years, I've been sort of promoting this step back lunge that we're going to go over here in detail, both in this video and also in some subsequent videos. So, with the lunge, where I sort of started thinking about this is I was having, athletes come in and they had some low back injuries. Squatting was one of the exercises that provoked the injury. And so then I can't just tell them to just sort of stop moving. So then I had to come up with an alternative. And that alternative was a step back lunge. Now, you might be thinking, like, a lunge, really? There's no way that you can replace the squat with a lunge. And if you do the lunge with a traditional technique, where at the bottom your shin's vertical and your spine's vertical, I agree with you. You just can't load that down enough. So we've sort of tweaked the way that we teach this so that we can actually get the athlete loaded down enough to get a similar benefit that you might get in the squat. So we're going to cover that in the next video, so make sure that you check that out. But the lunge itself, though, is going to be better than the squat for a bunch of reasons. The first one I just kind of mentioned. The squat is one of the main exercises that does produce injury to the low back in the weight room. I would say that the number one is the deadlift. The reason we can't take that out of programming is because that's how you pick stuff up. So it's important to have that sort of hinge pattern so that you can function in everyday life. The squat, though, I don't know if we need to load that down, right? Now you might say, well, we have to squat. And I would say, yes, we do have to squat. And it's important that if we take the squat out of the program, that we still maintain the ability to, express that pattern. So we need athletes, no matter what the sport, to be able to execute, a good full range of motion squat on command. They shouldn't need 15, 20 minutes of stretching. It should just sort of be there. So I'm not saying that we want to just get rid of the squat altogether. What I am saying is if we're going to have it in there, it would be more of like your secondary or tertiary exercise. You're not loading it so heavy. You might bias it towards front loaded so that you can get into that full depth squat, sitting all the way down ass to grass. But if you're loading it heavy, that's where it becomes a problem. So you have a lot of athletes that are going after these big lifts. And it's very, very common that, because of the hyperactivity of that posterior chain, if you're doing a back squat, or at the bottom of the squat and you fall into that butt wink, which is when the pelvis retroverts, tilts backwards, and that exposes the lumbar spine to loaded flexion, which is the number one way to produce disc injuries that are very, very common in squatting. So that's one reason. In the lunge, you don't have that, right? Because of the positioning of the back leg, it actually blocks the pelvis from retroverting too much. So you can never really get into a considerable butt wink unless you have that front foot raised a tremendous amount, which at the bottom of the squat, you're gonna have more issues with the back hip flexor and the hip capsule than you will with the actual low back. So the first reason why the lunge is gonna be better than the back squat is that it's able to protect the spine. So the low back is one of the number one reasons that takes athletes out of sports, especially if those athletes are using lots and lots of barbell strength training. Another one is that when we're training an athlete, we're actually training them to do something other than squat or lift weights. Unless you're, of course, working with athletes that are Olympic weightlifters, CrossFitters, and powerlifters. Although I do still think in those cases the lunge should be the predominant exercise there. But if we think about what are athletes doing and what are they doing in their sport, unless you're training a golfer, maybe a volleyball player, or of course a training sport athlete, it's likely that they're spending a lot of time in unilateral support. So if that's the case, what is the utility of having the predominant lower body exercise be bilateral? We want to make sure that those athletes are able to balance and cut and drive and all that kind of stuff. And you don't get that stimulus if you're training, bilateral barbell squatting. But you get that in the lunge, right? So when you have an athlete that is, you want to train them for the sport that they have to do, you want to make sure that the training is as best you can, at least to a certain degree, is simulating what they actually have to do in the sport. Well, unless you're some of those aforementioned sports where you're doing bilateral squatting, it's likely that they're not going to be spending a lot of time doing that. So we should be training them in that unilateral support. It's another reason for it. Also, if you want to think about just training, to try to get symmetry, a lot of athletes come into the office or in the gym and they actually are sort of asymmetrical. One leg is either they have more balance on that leg or one leg is much, much stronger than the other side. Well, both for performance and injury avoidance, we want to make sure that they're as symmetrical as possible. So if you're training a squat, there's no amount of valgus bands or therabands that you can pull in different directions that's going to actually correct that asymmetry. The only way to do it is through unilateral loading, which is maybe the most important benefit of the lunge, because you can actually strengthen the weak leg or you can improve the balance and the motor control of the weak leg. You can't really do that in the squat. Yes, you can get the legs to generate more force, but if your left leg is stronger than your right leg and you keep squatting, it's just going to go like this. There's no amount of bands that you can kind of work on to level that out. Lunging, you can do that. You're going to bias the loading for the weak leg, and that's going to bring that weak leg up, train that weak leg, and get them much, much more symmetrical. The other one was the balance issue, right? We don't think about balance or talk about balance very much in performance training, but it's actually tremendously important. And when you're doing squatting, there's not a lot of balancing going on. Whereas if you put them in a lunge, that front leg has to work really, really hard. So the muscles of the hip and of the foot and ankle, they have to work harder to control the positioning of the ankle, the knee, and the hip. That means that if they're working harder on controlling it, we're going to improve their overall stability and balance, which again is really, really important for performance and avoiding injury. Now, another really just sort of useful thing about the lunge is it doesn't require as much dorsiflexion as the squats do. So the back squat requires more than the front squat, but the lunge does not require that much. So there's a lot of athletes that you might be thinking of that they just cannot squat, at or below parallel. And those athletes are your basketball players or anybody really that has a morphology with really, really long legs and a really short torso. Those athletes are going to struggle to get below parallel and they're going to need a tremendous amount of dorsiflexion to do so. So if they don't have it and you're training them to do it and you keep having them do it, you're just exposing their body to sort of aberrant forces that might produce some injuries. If you put them in the step back lunge that we're going to cover in the next video, you kind of remove the need to do a lot of dorsiflexion at all. And so then they're able to train a squat pattern on that front leg without actually, putting them in a really, really bad position. So that's another great reason why the lunge is awesome. The last one is kind of an answer to the first criticism of the lunge. When you first heard me say oh, you should be doing lunging instead of squatting, and you're just like, dude, you can't load that down to get the stimulus or the neural drive that you're looking for, or even to get the tissue tension that you need for really, really good adaptation. But you actually can if you teach the lunge the way that we're going to cover in the next video. If you do your normal vertical, shin, vertical spine angle, then there's no way you're going to load that down. Actually, it's not going to replace squat for two reasons. One, there ain't no way because of the positioning of that back hip that you're going to be able to put enough load on the bar to stimulate the nervous system that you would in a heavy squat. The other reason it's not going to replace a squat is that front leg is not working like it does in a squat. It's working like it does in a lunge. And so because the movement pattern is going to be completely different, you're not going to get the same transfer. What we want to do is we want to actually have that front leg loaded a little bit more so that you're staying over that front leg. If you do that and you're kind of squatting down on that front leg, you're actually able to move a tremendous amount of weight. If you're doing a flat, like on the ground step back lunge, the bottom end of what an athlete should be able to do is actually move 70% of their relative max. What I mean by that is if their 5 rep max is 300 pounds or whatever, with the squat, they should be able to move 70% of that with a step back lunge, okay? So if we do a little bit of math on this and we think like, okay, somebody's got a 500 pound back squat. So when they actually are squatting, theoretically, they would have 250 pounds of load going through each leg. Well, if they're able to move 70%, or actually what I suggest that I want in my athletes is 80%, and that same athlete, if they've got a 300 pound squat, they're able to actually move it, instead of moving half the weight going through the front leg, it's actually 80% of that weight, or close to 80% is going through that front leg. So with the 500 pound back squat, instead of having the 250 pounds in each leg, now you've got actually 400 pounds going through that front leg, which is a lot more tissue tension and is going to actually produce a lot more sort of neural drive through that leg. So for all those reasons, I think the lunge is actually superior to the back squat. The struggle, though, is that there's a lot of tradition. The squat is a very, very cool thing. It's very, very cool to have a big squat. We all like it. But the question is it necessary for the athletes to achieve, that maximum physical expression in whatever sport that they're training for? I don't think that it is. And the challenge that I have for you guys is I want you to sort of try out the lunge that we're going to show in the next video. And you can do like a very, very easy sort of plug and play. You don't have to write a whole new lunge program. You're going to take your favorite squat program and you're just going to sort of start probably at 60% of the prescribed weight, and you're going to just plug and play the lunge. So if you're doing front squats, you're going to do front squats. If you're doing back squats, you're going to do back squats. Now, if you add that in there for no less than 6, ideally, 12, maybe even 15 weeks, I promise you that you will come back and your squat will be better. Even if you are a professional squatter, if you're a power lifter or you're an Olympic weightlifter or a CrossFitter, and you came to me and says, Rich, I need to add 50 pounds onto my squat, I would be giving you a lunge program. And the reason I'm confident in that is I've been giving this to athletes for many, many years, and almost every time they come back with a PR. So here's kind of how it started. Close to 10 years ago, I had some CrossFit athletes, some high-level CrossFit athletes in the office, and they had a back injury, and we can't just keep them from training. So I gave them this step-back lunge that we're going to cover in the next video. And, it was for about a month, we kept this particular athlete off of squatting. So then we send him back and said, hey, well, why don't we test the squat out? Classic, 2012 CrossFitter at the time, drinking the Kool-Aid. The kid went after it. So he went in and maxed his triple out. Well, he had a 15-pound PR on that triple, and he had not done a single squat at any point, in training, outside of training. He had not done any loaded squats whatsoever, and yet he went back, and then he's already stronger. Now, the great thing about it is he was able to work through an injury there. His back felt better, and he was able to actually improve his squat. So that was years ago. Since then, I can't even remember how many athletes this has happened to. It's almost at this point, I just sort of expect them to get a PR when we send them back in there. So, I have high confidence that the lunge is going to help you tremendously. And I know that if you actually test that out with one of your favorite tried and true, proven squat workouts, and you get really, really good results, and then suddenly your back isn't bothering you in the mornings, it doesn't take you as much time to warm up, and overall you're just sort of just feeling looser and more fresh. At that point, if you can experience that, I know that you're going to sort of understand really how powerful this lunge exercise is. And then maybe you take that squat that we've been using just because of tradition, and that's how you did it, and that's how you learn, and coaches and everybody else. And now we sort of slide that squat down into that secondary or tertiary movement where the load's a little bit lighter, maybe the reps are a little bit higher, and we maintain that really, really good movement pattern, that good, smooth squat movement pattern. But then we replace the squat with the lunge in those primary exercises where we're loading them down. So I'm going to show you guys how that I actually load this exercise. I'm going to show you a couple variations of it. It's an incredibly powerful exercise that I hope you guys will start using, not only because I want to help you guys train your athletes better, but we also want to have them be as healthy as possible so that you can train them as hard as you need to get them to achieve that maximum physical expression. So be sure to watch the next video here where we go in and we actually cover how to perform an effective step back lunge that can actually adequately replace a squat. See you soon.